everyone. We are just waiting a moment as we are watching the participants flooding in. So we'll take a moment here. All right, so I think we've kind of plateaued here. Welcome to the KMA speaker series. My name's Marlene Sherrilyn, and I'm the Vice President of KMA, and my KMA co-partner here, Amber Steele. And we are so pleased to introduce to those of you who've never had the pleasure of meeting our longtime resident, Ken Fisher. And many of you are longtime friends and mountain, go way back. So Ken, waving to us, will be sharing a presentation with us this evening. And then when he's done with the presentation, we will be open it up to Q&A. So for those that aren't aware, Ken actually studied forestry and econ at Humboldt State. And though he pursued finance as his profession, he definitely kept forestry as a very active hobby and a huge part of his life. He co-founded and funded actually the Fisher Lab at Humboldt State, which is responsible for 20 years of redwood research. So I would argue that it is a form of profession for you, Ken. Ken first came to Kings Mountain in the 1960s. He founded Fisher Investments, which was started on Kings Mountain. He and his wife, Sherry, have been married for over 50 years, and they have children who reside and grandchildren spend time on Kings Mountain. I think one other key fact that you may have read in his bio, he has a very impressive forest library, and it's actually one of the the largest private collection. And he's very passionate about and committed to historical perspectives. And I'm going to date myself, but at one time the Kings Mountain Country Store, which we lived right a few driveways away from, used to love to take our kids in there because of all the historical facts that were in that store. So it was just a treasure. And I know those were only a few of the many, many artifacts that you have found over time. So I am pleased to introduce Ken. And right before Ken goes, Amber's gonna give you a little technical lesson.
Hey friends, so this is a webinar which is slightly different, you might have noticed, from our normal Zoom meetings, mostly so that we can get more folks in here and have less bumps in the road technically on the way through Ken's presentation. So I just want to call your attention to a couple of things. You may have seen the poll that came up. If you would be kind enough to answer those two questions, we're curious whether you've seen Ken present for and where you heard about this speaker series from the KMA. And then if you are wanting to ask Ken a question during the Q&A, you can see on your right-hand side, there's a little Q&A doodad. It looks like two chat bubbles. And if you type a question in there, those questions will come to Marlene and I, and then we will sort them through so that we can kind of combine any that are really similar and ask those to Ken at the end of the talk. And then if you want to ask Marlene or I something technical, or you get stumped or anything like that, there's still the chat button, which is on your right-hand side. That's the single chat bubble icon. And that will, you can choose to chat either to everybody, including the attendees, or just to one of us at a time. And that way Ken can go through his presentation without too much distraction, and then we can kind of funnel everybody at the end. So let me know. I will be on chat if you are having any troubles that I might be able to help with. I'll do my best, and otherwise we will look for your questions in the Q&A.
Right. And for those of you who cannot see the poll, there's a place, if you just press the polling button, you can see it. But the question is, have you heard Ken's presentation about the history of Kings Mountain before? So 61%, 33 of 54 people have said yes, 17 have said no, and a smaller percentage, 6 people have read his work. So Ken, I think that's what would be most important for you. For the rest of us, it's helpful to know how you heard about tonight's. So thank you. Ken, it's all you.
Okie dokie. So first, thank you for wanting to hear about Kings Mountain history. And I'm going to babble at you for a while and try to run through a whole lot of visuals real fast, cover a lot of material, maybe a little more on early logging and milling technology than in the last time you might have heard me, since a lot of you heard me before. I'm kind of surprised to come back. But be that as it may, you know, I'm going to talk about the early years, which, you know, really goes up to about 1910, 1920, and not a whole lot's changed about everything from, you know, the beginning to 1910, 1920 since. So it's going to basically be the same stuff. Kings Mountain history really fits into this bow tie that I developed, you know, decades ago, where there's the part on the left and the part on the right and a little tight knot in the middle. The beginning, the pioneer era, is really 35 plus lumber mills, 2 hotels, schools, dairying on the northwest and the southwest, road construction, the Summit Springs area, Grabtown, hermits, characters, everything getting butched in logging, oxen, donkey engines, and the beginnings of industrialization, shingling, and of course the King family. Lots of fire. As the timber gets almost completely whacked in the first generation, that's kind of going from 1907 to where there's, you know, almost there's only 2 mills that operate basically after 1907, and they operate sporadically and are over and done in 1920. And the population, which had been almost as big as the Kings Mountain population is now, decreases to almost nothing in the 1910 to 1950 areas, largely summer cabin development, subdivisions done by the Bromfield family, recreational stuff, some little bit of rum running. And then you get to the beginning of the post-war era, which leads to the beginning of Kings Mountain Elementary and the beginning of permanent residents year-round in volume that aren't hermits, and all the stuff that developed after that. The mountain traditionally is defined in historical census as everything from 92 and 35 south to the southern end of Bear Gulch West, above 800 feet in elevation, and then in some places where there's continuous activity to slightly lower elevations, particularly in Prisma Canyon and just a few other little sub-gulches. When we think of the roads, you know, really were not the way they are quite today. The road from 9235 up to the top of Skyline ran almost where it runs now. Skyline itself, as we know it, was built in 1920, 1922. But you can see, in fact, a couple of years ago, you could see very clearly as you went down when they mowed everything, you could see on the right-hand side as you went downhill parts of the old roadway. Which are still in very good shape. I'm amazed at what good condition that old Summit Road is if you walk it. And places like Harkins and Comstock are named after individuals, but they were all named by Bromfield. We'll talk about Bromfield later, and we'll talk about Harkins, and we'll talk about Comstock. But Harkins was never living on Harkins, and Comstock was never living on Comstock. It's all stuff from the Bromfields. Star Hill Road, was a major through road in those days to get to Pescadero. Stagecoach ran from Redwood City to Pescadero over it. And originally Tenutes Creek Road was not called Tenutes Creek Road. It was originally called Froment Road. We'll talk about Eugene Froment. But road development was a big part of the early era of the mountain. This is the guy that the mountain's named after, basically, Frank King and his wife, Honoré. I've always believed that little part on her left eye there was because Frank was drunk a lot and probably popped her a few times. It's a different world that we live in today. This is the thing that derived the name. It is the Kings Mountain Brauhaus. It was the Brauhaus because it sat on the brow of the mountain, right at the junction of what's today Kings Mountain Road, Tenutes Creek Road, and Skyline, in the northwest corner where there's kind of that little flat that goes back in there that extends just a little bit off of the pullout. It was ripped down in 1937, finally after it had stopped use since after 1910 by a guy named Lou Boggio, who used the lumber from it and what have you to build another bar restaurant, but not hotel, right, same location, but just a little bit further out and sort of right on the edge, called the Kings Mountain Inn during the summer cabin era, of course. And then that turned into Brock's. And for some of the old timers, you may remember Brock's. It burned down in '68, same building, but it was Vic and Alberta Brock that ran it. And I mean, when I was a kid in the 50s, I used to eat hamburgers at Brock's, and knew them very well. But this hotel you're seeing here is looking out toward the ocean over Prisma Canyon. On the right is Frank King. I do not know who all of the women are. The one on the upper right is Mary A. Dolly King. We'll see her in a minute. That's her on the horse. This is later, after it's no longer a hotel. The Kings, so I got ahead of myself. I do that a lot. In the earliest era, you have the Native Americans. Native Americans have almost no use for Kings Mountain. In the entirety of time, there's been almost nothing discovered on Kings Mountain that shows any sign of Native American usage. There are some grinding rocks in the Old Ranch Road area, a few bits of obsidian that were found there. There's 2 shell mounds that have been found, one off Star Hill and one off Native Sons. I've always believed, although there's no real way to know, that runway that runs up from Native Sons up onto Star Hill, and more or less the way Star Hill runs to get down to Redwood City, is the natural, easiest slope of progression for a natural path to get from southwest coast side into the Redwood City area for trade. And the Native Americans were known to trade coast to coast. It would have been easy to go from San Mateo to the Half Moon Bay side, coast to coast. But if you wanted to get further south, that's the logical route. And that's probably why those shell mounds are there. The shell mounds only had garbage in them, flakes of obsidian. Probably they got obsidian when they went to the east. They climbed back up over the hill, camped at night, chipped away. The chips are what's behind, along with shells, because that's what the food. And off they went to get to wherever they were having their camps in the west, on the coast. The 2 major land grants that actually convene right here where the King's Hotel was, the Raimundo land grant on the Raimundo land grant on the east side of Skyline, going all the way down to the bottom, issued to John Coppinger, and the Cañada Verde Arroyo de la Purísima grant on the west side, where they had joined. The Spanish and Mexicans didn't have much use for Kings Mountain either. There's nothing here for them, as we'll see in a minute. Big timber and no real way to process the big timber. So it was kind of a no man's land, and the Kings were squatters. They just built on it. They built on the border that ended up, after survey, to have been determined to be on the Cañada y Raimundo land grant. By then owned by John Greer, and Greer sued. They won in court technically. Greer won in court technically, but the judge gave them the property where the hotel was and the 30 acres that are the meadow on the east side of Skyline from Kings Mountain Road in through that meadow that runs back to the trees. And that 30 acres remained in the King family for a long, long time. But the mountain got its name because people came from the flats to this hotel as a destination, and then went back and spread the word that they had been to Kings Mountain Brow House, and then the place became known as Kings Mountain. This is the King family. They had only 1 set of active descendants. Dolly married a guy named Floyd Granger, who's a very prominent guy in Redwood City. That kid named, amazingly, King Granger. And King Granger ended up owning all that. King, his last widow, after he died, gave me a lot of this stuff a long time ago. This is another hotel that was actually even a little bit, largely parallel to the King's Hotel. It's being built in 1868. It's called the Summit Springs House. It sat on what is now the Garrett property of 2001 Kings Mountain Road, just as you come off of Skyline down where you get to those first two gates on the right. It's hard to see it today, but it's meadowy back in there. And the Summit Springs House sat in that meadow. It was built by Eugene Froment. Eugene Froment is important in a lot of ways. Froment bought basically all of Genghis Canyon in 1868, 67, 68. And built the roadway from the bottom of his property only at the time, all the way up to the top, where it connects to Star Hill Road. And it was called Froment Road. And then he needed to have a place, it's such a long route by wagon to haul lumber up from, that he needed a place to be able to overnight his people. And he built the Summit Springs Hotel to overnight those people. It really wasn't very successful because a lot of the millmen preferred just basically to camp out in the meadow. And yet it survived for quite a while through several different managers. Most importantly, the Wyman family ran it for a long time. Froment himself, basically, the mill went bust in 1876. And as the mill went bust, it was taken over by the Bank of San Jose and sold off to the Saunders family, who moved it and ran it in two different locations in Tenutes Canyon on property now owned by Kings Grove. But the Summit Springs House lasted for a good long time, and yet it was a rough place for rough men and rough people, the higher end people that would come from San Francisco or and go back to some place and talk about the mountain. They'd go to the King's Hotel. And that's why the name Kings took, but the town built at Summit Springs. Summit Springs included on the other side, on the north side of Kings Mountain Road, directly across from 2001 Kings Mountain Road, that, where that trailway goes in and it goes around the meadow. There was a livery stable, there was a store, and in the far corner of that meadow was the original Ferris School. We'll talk about Ferris. I'll show you pictures of Ferris. Ferris is important in other ways. That Ferris School didn't last any period of time at all, and I could never find any actual sign of the Ferris School itself there. But Ferris paid for it. It burned down, and then Ferris rebuilt it. And the second Ferris School, which ran until 1912, in its own bizarre way, is still standing today, and I'll show it to you. But there's the Summit Springs Hotel when it's under the management of the Wymans. You can't tell, but that's Mrs. Wyman there. And that little boy there is George Wyman. We'll see a picture of him later. This is the first Caucasian resident of Kings Mountain. His name's James Peace. He jumped ship sometime, nobody really knows when, between 1835 and 1842. As a ship jumper, he was paranoid that they would come look for him. Allegedly, according to rumor, he was purported to have had his place on Kings Mountain, actually almost just a hair's whisker away from where Marlene Stern's house is. Just there because he wanted to be able to go just a little bit further out on that Hog's Nose where the radio station transmitters are, because you could get a good view of the coast and see if the ships were coming for him. And if you actually look on a map today, that area is designated as Pice Hill, P-I-S-E, which is a misspelling of the name Peace. Jimmy Peace was heavily Irish, and they didn't quite understand how he pronounced his name. He was a guy that worked saw pits. We'll talk about saw pits in a minute, but he lived there and rode his horse down to the crossroads at Woodside, where he just on that creek there worked for Bill LaSawyer. This is the tree that to King Grove members and inhabitants in Anita's Canyon is known as Big Stump. Before it was cut down and made 1.25 million shingles. Those are the Saunders brothers, Ambrose and Joshua. That guy on the left is George Fisher, no relation to me. He was their accountant. But this tree is symbolic of the fact that the technology that the Spanish and the Mexicans and Native Americans had, and in fact, even the earliest Americans, could not have begun to process a tree like this for lumber. Just too massive. This, of course, is where, this is an old map. This map is so old that it calls the Sierra big trees Sequoia gigantea, which is today neither their genus nor their species, but coastal redwood and Sierra redwood. The Sierra redwood range, the coastal redwood range runs now where it ran then, up into Curry County in Oregon and down into Monterey County, and intermittent. And you can see where we in Kings Mountain are in that one dot there, South San Francisco. Going back to Jimmy Peace and the saw pits, this is an example of a saw pit. You roll the log onto a structure, one guy's below, one guy's above. The guy on the bottom doesn't like it at all. And by the time you get finished cutting a board, A, you're both exhausted, and B, it doesn't work very well if the log is too big, too much friction. So they didn't really have the capability to take the mountain's big trees. They took little redwoods. Now, an old growth redwood forest is always what's called an uneven age forest. It's got trees of every age category in it. And so they just, in the earliest users of wood, including the earliest Caucasians, just took the little trees. Here's another example of a saw pit. Here's another example of a saw pit structure. It's not in a pit, but it's the same thing. You can see there's an actual photograph instead of a drawing. They're using little logs because that's what worked. In this, you see a little black spot, and the little black spot is here with my hand on it. This is from a long time ago. My hand looks worse than that now. And the feller that would take down the tree, typically two of them, would put this, what's called a springboard notch, just a few inches into the wood through the bark on the ridge of the bark. You know, old growth redwood has its bark in ridges and furrows. Because it's thicker with the ridge, you cut through the ridge, you get just into the wood, and then you take this thing called a springboard, the metal tip on the end of a board. Here's another one. This kind's actually more common. I found numbers of these digging up Kings Mountain mills. I never found one of this style. And you take that board and you take it kind of, you can see me here with my hands, and you insert it into that hole and lower it down. And the metal tip bites into the wood, and then you can stand on the back of it. And the guys who were good at this were just like monkeys with them. I mean, they could bounce on the board and swivel it to get it so they could move themselves around. And you can see here one stuck in a stump. But when Ambrose, this is just tangential piece of oddity, when Ambrose Lambert named coastal redwood Sequoia sempervirens, he did not name it meaning to be the evergreen tree, as so many people think it was, because most conifers are, almost all conifers are evergreen trees. He named it sempervirens to imply the ever-living root, because when you cut the tree down, it's one of the only conifers where the root doesn't die. And if you leave a springboard after you've cut it down in the springboard notch, the tree will actually keep growing and overgrow the springboard. And that springboard, this is on Kings Grove property with a buddy, that's a buddy of mine there. You can't get that thing out of there because it's the stump is overgrown the springboard. There's actually a couple of those on Kings Mountain that are overgrown like that. But if you weren't so good, they'd put a couple of them in and then put boards across them and stand on them to start chopping the tree down. If they were better, more like this one on the right, the guy just stand on it and swivel it around. In this tree, this depicts a lot. They're going to use handsaw. They're going to use axes. With the axes, they're going to cut the wedge that guy's laying in. They're going to do that by standing on the springboards. When you bring an axe down for felling, you bring it in at waist height naturally. It's almost impossible to do it otherwise. And so the distance between the top of the springboard and the guy's heel takes you right to where his waist was. So you can actually see how tall the feller was who cut the wedge. And then you go around behind it with a saw, and the two guys start sawing through and putting a wedge behind the saw so the saw won't bind. And when there's no longer enough fiber to hold the weight of the tree up, the hinge, like I'm doing with my hand, will collapse over where the man is laying, and the tree will fall that way. In this case, as you're looking at that picture, it would fall off to your left. And the guys that dropped these trees were really good at doing it, most of them. I mean, the guys that did it all the time were very, very good. Those two bottles you see hanging there are to put lubricant on the saw. So this tree, for example, would come straight at you. Here's another one would come straight at the guy. Here's another one. This one going away gives you a sense of the magnitude. When one of these trees comes down at that scale, it feels like a major earthquake. Yeah, I mean, the ground shakes. And it shakes for a while. And then there's this infinite still afterwards. That guy looks calm. I promise you he isn't or wasn't. Once it's on the ground, processing it's non-trivial. You can tell that this guy is, obviously a graduate of Yale forestry. And the fact is, these are rough people doing rough work. And so the process here is you cut a little bit of the bark out. Again, monster structure. How are you going to even move that thing in those days? Once you put those little, you cut out a little strip of bark every 16 feet, 16 plus a few inches, and then you start sawing. That guy in this picture is certainly not actually the guy doing the work. Just look at him. Look at his belly. Guys that did this work didn't have bellies like that. The saws had to be sharpened every day. The sharpening was actually quite a technology. The saws evolved over 50 years quite heavily. You had to peel off the bark with a peeler. All this stuff wasn't of any good to them in those days. In all extractive industries, lumbering included in the 19th century, transportation costs is more than half the total cost of production. So anything that got in your way of transportation costs you want to get rid of, and they cut all the limbs off, they took all the bark off. They did that before it dried out in the late spring, and then they set everything on fire to burn it to get rid of it. They didn't care about the edgewood. Resource wasn't rare. Transportation cost was expensive. So if they burned some of the edgewood, they didn't care. Then they would haul down these skid roads. Just for sake of demonstration, skid road comes from, you've heard the phrase skid row. Skid row is actually a reference that derived from the specific skid road that went into Seattle. And the skid roads go into every mill site. And the early skid road going to Seattle, like most other skid roads, hauled down to a mill site. And then on the weekend, these guys drank a lot. And if they had a propensity for alcohol and couldn't make it back to work on Monday morning, they were known as stuck on skid road, and because they couldn't make it back out to the field. And this particular skid road is in Corte Madera Canyon, and a picture taken by a friend of mine in the 1950s, Phil Chris, who actually I was talking to today on the phone. This is a picture from La Honda, not from Kings Mountain. That guy on the right is George Wyman, that was raised in the Summit Springs house. And he's the bullwhacker in this instance. The bullwhacker leads the bulls down. They're voice commandable. Guy is left, Haw is right. He taps them with a goading stick. That stick he's holding has a tiny little brad in it, and he just touches them on the shoulder to tell them, I want to talk to you. And then he tells them what he wants them to do, and they do it. The oxen are actually more valuable to the mill than most of the men. And I mean, the human life was cheap for them in those days. And but when the oxen died, they turned them into soup. And you go to any one of these mills, and there's lots of oxen bones that you find, because once they died, they ate them. Here's one in Corte Madera Canyon, and you can see, this group of 10 is pulling a very long log train, slightly downhill all the way. The logs are embedded in the ground, perpendicular. There's logs, kind of this big, embedded in the ground, perpendicular to the log train direction. And then There's lubricant applied to the logs as the harvestable logs are skidded over them. And this is another Prisma Canyon shot. And the reality of this is primitive. In these days, there's no environmental concern that they could destroy the forests, because in the pre-industrial revolution era, there's no technology that allowed them to envision. I mean, we today cannot quite envision a world that is non-industrialized. They, in those days, couldn't visualize a world that would be industrialized because that hadn't happened yet. And so they didn't think about, are we going to run out of trees? They didn't think that was possible. Oxen that I was showing you had to be shod. They are a cloven hoof beast, two shoes per foot. And every mill ran its own oxen operation. And these stalls were at every mill site. This is not a local shot. This is not a local shot, but this is the one that was at the Hartley MacArthur Mill in Corte Madera Canyon. Corte Madera Canyon, in this case, is this part of Corte Madera Canyon is the part to the left off of Star Hill Road as you're going downhill on Star Hill. Again, you can see the evidence of the fire. This is a transition period, the beginning of the steam era and industrialization, where you've got the oxen on the bottom, and in the back you can see what's called the donkey engine. Donkey engines derived by this guy, John Dolbear. John Dolbear invents the donkey engine. He's part of a logging operation in Eureka, California, known as Dolbear and Carson, and he's the San Francisco-based sort of marketing and technology guy. And the donkey engine works like this. It's got these wooden skids on the bottom, like skis, and a vertical steam engine and gearing. And then originally designed for rope, used soon thereafter with cable. High carbon steel cable was developed just right after the donkey engine was developed, all part of the explosion of the Industrial Revolution. And you take the cable out, you connect it to a tree, you turn the steam engine on, and the gearing will pull you to the tree you connected to. And then when you get to where you want to be, you've got these lashing hooks on the side, or rings, and you lash off to 3-4 trees, and then you can reverse the gearing and pull logs into you. So here's a picture of one, and you can see the side rings, and they go cross country in rough terrain. And they're also very dangerous because those steam boilers would explode regularly and kill people. Here's one from Gazos Creek, but sometimes they're vertical spools, sometimes horizontal spools. Here's a example of the horizontal spool, but you can see the amount of cable on the back of that. This is the beginning of being able to pull long distances and yank logs long ways to a mill. Here's another one. Again, same thing, pull the logs long ways. This is in Prisma Canyon. Briefly, there was this usage of this thing called a traction engine. I only found one traction engine in Prisma Canyon or any other part of Kings Mountain, which was in Prisma. And, but they only worked on flat land. And in the Midwest, they used them a lot for farming between, about 1900 and 1915, 20, until tractors got better. But they would, the yarding cables would work around these spools, and the spools would allow you to go around corners. You could thread them on the inside, thread them on the outside, depending on which way you wanted to go. And they were actually pretty common, stuck on stumps in the trees, in the woods. The original saws were not capable of taking our trees. The original saws worked like this, made for little trees. Eventually, they got to where they take 2 5-foot diameter blades, put one on top of the other, and now you get almost 5 feet between axles, and they'd run bigger ones through. Then they get to band saws that do still more, but it's a problem because of the size of the biggest stumps that you've seen on Kings Mountain. So they would instead take a long auger, drill holes down the spine of the tree, pack them with simultaneous powder, and blow them apart. And literally, when they blew them apart, now they could run them through the smaller sized blades. Here you see a picture of one blown. They're pretty good at doing that without wasting too much. But again, I want to reiterate, raw material was not their primary concern. They jack them around. The inside of a mill looked like a complete Rube Goldberg design, very primitive. the original saw blades got replaced by this Nathan Spaulding from San Francisco invention, which became famous nationwide, of replaceable saw teeth. You go to one of these mills and you find one of these mills close to wherever the head rig was to reduce the logs into rough boards. You would find hundreds of these thrown away once they get damaged, because you only have to get rid of the replaceable tooth, not the whole 5-foot diameter blade. And Nathan Spaulding started with this design and then later created a crescent like this, which was more efficient. And you find both versions depending on how old the mill was. Inserted like this. This is an advertisement here. There's a mill in Sebastopol that opens a few weekends a year, the Sturgeon Mill. And it actually operates with 19th century technology. On the inside, when they open up, if you're interested in seeing how this stuff was done, I encourage you to go there, look them up, Sturgeon Mill online. And they open up a few weekends a year. It's all volunteer, it's non-commercial, it's a museum. It's a working museum. And you can see how they do this. You see that spike that's driven into the log? There's two of those at an angle, 45 degrees, that holds the log in place. Those are called dogs. And then they push the thing into the saw. You can see the saw whirling on the left there as it turns this into a square beam. But it's all very primitive and rough. And there's the two blades on top of each other. Again, this is the port of Redwood City at the time. All the lumber went up over the top of the mountain, down the other side on Kings Mountain Road, to the port of Redwood City, loaded on ships, and mostly went to San Francisco, which of course burned down several times, so a lot of it went up in smoke. What didn't get made into lumber got made into shingles. They would cut into these bolts and then split down like this, and then run shingling machines that just sliced off shingles. Eventually, at first split what you used to call when you were young, if you remember these, shakes. And then first there were shakes and then there's shingles. But shingling is more efficient than the shakes. It's not split stuff. And it's just more efficient usage and actually better. This guy is the shingle king. Sheldon Purdy Ferris. He wasn't Purdy. He was just Sheldon Ferris. He was a 49er. He sought gold for 4 years. In 53, he gave up. And with a donkey and a hand splitter called a froe and a mallet, he went into Corte Madera Canyon and started going after remnants of logs that had been left behind because they were good wood, but too short without knots and damage for lumbermen to be ready to haul. Lumbermen wanted things that could be turned into at least 8 feet, hopefully 2 16-foot pieces, because that's the optimal size for hauling. And Ferris was inventive, he was hardworking, and from 1853 until he died in 1884, he became the largest landowner in San Mateo County. He owned a mill in every major canyon. He was the largest private sector employer in the county. And he lived in this house, which sat, some of you, for all I know, Jim Wickett's on the line tonight. This sat almost exactly where Jim Wickett's place is on the end of Star Hill Road. I mean, literally that house sat within feet of where Jim Wickett's house is. He is here in this picture on the right-hand side. He's the guy in the really dark coat. You can't really see him very well there. This is his Prisma Canyon crew, including, you can see the oxen on the left. You can see the cook in the middle. Derry is up close. He's not an attractive man. He's rough. He's always single. He never had any children, never got married. He had relatives, came from the East Coast. He had relatives in the East Coast. I've met descendants of his, just actually not too many years ago. In fact, they were thrilled when they came out to the West Coast, and I took them out to Jim's place and showed them the property. And they had Moore and Depew lithographs at the property, and they were just stunned that the Moore and Depew lithographs were almost perfectly accurate of what you could see when you stand there where Jim's house is. And he was thought to go crazy. He Some people think he committed suicide. Some people think he was murdered. I've always believed in the murder theory. We could talk about that in Q&A if you want, but when he died, his empire vanished and was largely taken up by the people on the coroner's jury that sat in a judgment that said he was committed suicide. This is his mill in Prisma Canyon. That mill, Frank Stanger wrote a book, Sawmills in the Redwoods, that I wrote the second introduction for. And it's a great book. Stanger calls this the Borden Hartley mill. He's wrong. He was wrong. Stanger was great. I mean, you can't say enough good things about Stanger, but that mill is the Sheldon Purdy Ferris mill in Prisma Canyon. This is looking at it from the hill on the west side, north side of Prisma. That's Prisma Creek. You can see the two little buildings there, and you can see the cookhouse. You can see the two little buildings there. You can see where Prisma Creek is, and you're just looking at it from the other side of the creek in this one from that one. There's so many things that I can tell you about my lifetime there doing all these things. I haven't lived full time on the mountain since 2013, but shortly before I left the mountain on President's Day that year, I actually found a dead guy at this site. And called the sheriff's department and showed him the dead guy. They could never figure out who the dead guy was. They believed it was like some drug killing or something. But it's primitive. It's hard to find anything there. It's all rough territory. You can get a sense of that just from this picture. There's that cookhouse from back here. You can see the cookhouse in the right. There's the cookhouse. Excuse me. These are from the Ferris School. Sheldon Purdy Ferris is important because no family, no kids. He funded the school twice. The school educated everybody until it shut in 1912. Its last teacher actually graduated from Ferris School. I have her graduation diploma, which was given to me by her nephew when he died. Actually, when he died, he left me all of her stuff in his will. But this is one of the Ferris School books. This is the Ferris School. Now that building stands today on Sweat Road. Excuse me, Star Hill Road. I misspoke. You just don't know it does. I'm thinking lots of you have driven Star Hill Road. If you've been around for a long time, you've certainly gone down there. He paid to have this built. Same building. Kids. That building is still there. George Sweat just cut the sides out of it and built a house around it. And it's inside the walls of that house on Star Hill Road, still today. These are some of the students. The dark-haired girl in the back is Katie Durham. We'll see her in a bit. The tall guy on the right is Charlie Durham. I don't know that teacher. This is the inside. This is looking at the back of the bench toward the front of the inside of the Ferris School. Mary A.C. Monroe is the aunt that her nephew left this stuff to me. Her name was Cordelia. Went by the name Delia. There she is. That's Cordelia Monroe. This is the inside of the school. Now, this picture is particularly important in terms of understanding where their life was in one way. You see on the left, on that wall, the back wall, you can see that there's a map there. So that's the Davenport Bromfield 1894 map of San Mateo County. It's actually the best early map ever made of San Mateo County. And of course, you can see it's large there hanging on the wall. They've got some other maps, but this is the most important one to them because it's not terribly important to them how life was in, let's say, Ohio, because they're not likely to go to Ohio. But the boy or girl in that school needs to know how to ride their horse to Redwood City, or how, when they have to go in once a month to San Francisco, what roads they have to take if they're going to, have to, be 13 and take their father's wagon into San Francisco to go do something for their father. How do they get from there, where they are, to what was then the fourth largest town in San Mateo County, Pescadero. The four major towns in those days were Redwood City was the biggest, Half Moon Bay was the second biggest, San Mateo was third, and Pescadero was fourth. And so when you're out there in the middle of no place, how are you going to get to someplace? This had the roads, this had the property owners, it had the names of the property owners, so you could know whose property you were going through when you were going over a road that went through somebody's property, because they almost all did. And this is the guy that made that map, Davenport Bromfield. Now, Davenport Bromfield was an interesting character. He lived in San Mateo Park, but he fell in love with Kings Mountain, and he had a place at the kind of corner of County Road in Filbert that he stayed at originally in the 1890s, called Carmel Cottage. And he then later bought and subdivided most everything on the west side of Kings Mountain. So for example, if you're at Henrik Ibsen Park, he'd owned that. If you're on Old Ranch Road, he owned that, or Henrik Ibsen Road, he owned that. He named Comstock Road after Nathan Comstock. He named Harkins Road after George Harkins. He really was the guy that laid out the west side of Kings Mountain in roads and subdivisions. If you live on the west side of Kings Mountain, once upon a time, he or his family owned the land you're on, almost certainly. This is George Sweat that turned that school, into Ferris School, into a home. That home is still there. This is the home. If you drive down Star Hill Road, there's a point as you're going down, or if you look back on as you're going down Star Hill Road, once you get past Sweat, when you get to the first house on the left, if you stop and look back to the right, you'll see this house. Maybe whoever owns it now is on the call. I don't know whoever owns it now. But that gable, that's the gable of the Ferris School. There's the white boards of the Ferris School building. On the inside, when you go into the attic, there is the Ferris School building. It's still there. It's just George Sweat built this house around it. That's actually, I still own that car. This is Rufus Hatch. And Rufus Hatch, along with George Borden, were the main developers of mills in Prisma Canyon. There he is when he's young. This is their main mill in Prisma Canyon. I did a documentation at this site a long, long time ago when my 42-year-old was about 7. And I got a picture of that son sitting on that stump that you see, which is riddled with bullet holes. And I used the bullet holes as documentation by blowing this picture up that it's the same stump. But that's from the same location. That's what it looks like today. It's so overgrown compared to what it was. Again, they cut everything and they butchered it completely. This is Alvin Hatch, Rufus Hatch's son. He's the next generation of significant milling, along separately with George Borden's son, Charlie. Rufus and George got along great. Charlie and Alvin didn't. Charlie thought that Alvin was a whippersnapper. Alvin was actually a lot smarter than Charlie. And Alvin is the one that Hatch School is named after in Half Moon Bay. Alvin was one of the founding members of the San Mateo County Planning Commission in the 1930s and the longest serving county supervisor in San Mateo County history. But he ran this mill in Prisma Canyon. I excavated the heck out of this mill site. There were still standing buildings and stuff when I was a kid there, and in the 1960s. And in this group, there's some of these people that we know, but this mill site is literally, if you take where that wagon is sitting. If you walk down Prisma Canyon Road, all the way, from the one end of the open space parking lot to the other end, you go right past exactly where this building is. You'd stand where that set of wagon wheels are. It's just off the road at this one point. It's overgrown there now, but it's still meadowy. And you know Harkins Road. So that guy in the front with that cap on, with his hand resting on his right his right hand resting on his right thigh. That's George Harkins. And the guy on the just to his right, it's kind of blondish. That's the Charlie Borden that we saw as a boy in the school picture, right there. This is George Harkins when he's old. So Harkins lived in a cabin just immediately to the south of the open space parking lot, past that kind of swale. And there's the open space parking lot, the northern open space parking lot. Then there's the swale, and then there's a house that Gustavo Rabin built. I'm not sure who lives there now. And he was raised across the street. His father, John, owned this piece of property, which then Skyline used to go off a little bit more to the east. And when it was built in 1920, ran right to Harkins' property and cut just a little piece of it off on the east side. Harkins moved to the west side and built that cabin. This is the cabin as it stood. I was in that cabin a lot of times because that's, almost right next door to where I used to live, where Fisher Investments is. This is the backside, the functioning side of the mill that Charlie Borden, the second generation of Bordens, and a guy named Hartley made. And here it is decrepit many years later, taken as a photograph, same place, but from, if you were looking at the way back of this, that's where the picture was taken from, that's this. And those cabins that are up there, there's a little road. This is right at the junction of where Grabtown Gulch comes into Prisma Creek. I ought to talk about Grabtown. Grabtown, which comes right off of Janice Creek Road at the end of the Kings Grove property on the right-hand side where Sybil Plank lives. Sybil Plank lives square right in the middle of what was Grabtown. Again, this was originally Froment Road, and Froment allowed people to live on this property as communal. They take scrap lumber from the mill site and build, and the town, Grabtown, survived long past the Froment Mill, and people would just simply move in when somebody else moved out, and you'd grab their house. That's why it was called Grabtown. Grabtown is still on the U.S. topo map. It was a civilization for a good long time. It had no stores, none of the things like Summit Springs had, but Grabtown was a very active site for a long time. The northwest part of the mountain and the southwest part of the mountain included derriers. I mentioned that in the very beginning of this talk. And the derriers were a different breed. Millmen were rough, drank a lot, caroused, did any debauchery you could think of, and were also tough. The dairymen were tough in their own different way, but they were civilized. They were family people. They were people that built, stayed, stuck. This is Thomas Moylan. Thomas Moylan owned the tract of land on the west side of Skyline. As you're coming up from 95, after you get out of the continuous windy curves, and you're coming up that first long straight stretch before you dip over the hill for the second long straight stretch, he had the bottom part of that straight stretch. He had black lung disease and moved out there to get away from San Francisco, where he'd been a coal merchant, and decided to dairy and deal with the clean air. He had a wife and a couple daughters, and the family basically died off except for his daughter Magdalena, who Moylan married off at 16 years old to 42-year-old Peter Van Winkle, who was the next door neighbor that owned the stretch above him on Skyline on the same side, west side. Peter Van Winkle may have been older in all, 42 versus 16, but he was what would be deemed an earnest man, a good man, a man that was trustworthy, and he was a dairier. Dairying in those days was mostly in these small farms for cheese, not for actual drinking milk. But he dairied and sold into San Francisco. He took over the Moreland property as well. He and Magdalena had 11 children, 10 of whom lived. I knew one of the daughters very well, and their epicenter was where the Al Bell lives, right at the the top of the hill goes over and down the other side. Then before you get to the second straight stretch going up, it was the place on the right. There's their house. They because they ran cattle, everything got mowed and stomped. They also had sheep. They were civilized people. Peter Van Winkle was trustee of the Ferris School, trustee of the Laguna School. The Laguna School is off the mountain. Laguna School. As you went down Summit Road, Skyline Boulevard, and you hit 35 and you turn right as if you were going east to San Mateo, before you get to the lakes off to the right was the Laguna School that serviced all of the farming area of the area before the lakes were built, and serviced the area actually after the lakes were built. And of course, on the right, as you went down there, on the other side of the road, there was the original Mountain House restaurant, which is again off the mountain, but people went to the mountain routinely were there. The Mountain House restaurant got busted. That Mountain House restaurant on 35 got busted during Prohibition regularly. This is the Beebe home. It sits now on land Jim Wickett owns. It's again dairying on the southwest side of the mountain. When I would first be on this property, there were still lots of logging artifacts on it and what have you, because off as you're looking at this picture to the left is the East Fork of the Tenitas Creek. You're seeing that little swale is the East Fork of the Tenitas Creek. And up on the East Fork was the Clarence Hayward Mill, which is also on Jim Wickett property. And the Clarence Hayward Mill, I don't know how, I don't know why, but there was lots of stuff from it that ended up on the Beebe property. Here's another shot of it. Phil Chris took these pictures in the 1950s. And again, an awful lot of what I know early on, I know from Phil Chris and his father, Don, who is kind of a worthy story. Phil was 9 years old, and he and a buddy went hiking out in the woods, climbed up over the top. They lived off of Kenyatta Road in Redwood City, and climbed up over the top of Kings Mountain, down the other side, got lost in the woods. Phil's getting sick, getting a fever, fog's coming in, getting dark. And they come across these buildings in the middle of no place, these deserted buildings and all this stuff. And they don't have any idea what it is, but they know it's getting dark. And they're thinking they're going to go downhill until they get to the ocean, but the ocean's not there. And so they hole up in these cabins for the night. And the father's worried. And the next morning, the two boys keep going downstream. And in those days, there was a ranch called La Bella Vista Ranch. It was owned by a guy named George Keyston. And Keyston was president of the Pacific Stock Exchange. And it's exactly where Neil Young later had the epicenter of his property. And they knock on the door, and Keyston lets them call their father on the phone. And father comes and gets them. And the boys tell him this story. And there's all this stuff. And they found all this. And it was just, what is this? It's like a ghost town. And after Phil's recovered, Father Don and Phil go out and try to retrace the steps, find the same place. And in this place are hundreds and hundreds of old whiskey bottles. And Don Chris gets completely enamored with this. And for a good long time, maybe 15 years, Don's a bottle collector using history to find mill sites to find bottles. He becomes the dean of the Bay Area bottle collectors, over 25,000 bottles. He was just this marvelous man. I tracked him down in the Sierras when I was young, and he taught me so much about Kings Mountain. He'd draw me all these very accurate maps and tell me, go here and look for this and do the other. This is Katie Durham, that was raised just up the way from that Beebe house and went to the Ferris School. You saw her as a little girl. This is the Saunders Mill in Tenitas Canyon. There's Ambrose Saunders again. You saw him standing at the big tree early on. This is the Sampson Mill further down in Tenitas Creek, just in those cabins, the first cabins that you get to as you get to the bottom of Tenitas Creek. This is the office of the Virginia Mill right off of Star Hill Road. Those two trees are still there. This is actually where one of the shell mounds was for that has been documented. And again, this is what the buildings look like when I would first see them that were remnant at the Virginia Mill. This is the dam at the Virginia Mill. Parts of it are still standing in Corte Madera Canyon. These buildings are from Prisma Canyon. That's my son inside. I don't know how old Nathan was then, but inside standing old growth redwood and Prisma. And the fact is, most of the remaining old growth trees, what you would call an old growth tree, what I would call a pre-settlement tree, most of the remaining ones that you still see are that simply because, like this one, they wouldn't be worth anything to the timber operator. It's too dangerous to take down, and from the inside, there's going to be too much rot in the first couple log coming off the butt. And so they wouldn't even try. They just leave them there. This is in Prisma Canyon also. It's the twistiest known redwood in the world. It's a tree I discovered quite some time back. You can see the twist in it. That tree is 212 feet tall and makes 6 full twists to the top. And with a redwood like this, if you see the twist in the bark, twists also in the wood. So, this was of no use. Right around this tree, it was completely clear cut. And my guess is originally before logging days, it was taller than 212. But it just keeps going up. It's a freak. There's a lot of twisty redwoods, but none as twisty as this one. This is the sentinel tree just off of Skyline. When clear cut days came, you could see this tree from San Mateo County, from San Mateo City clearly because it was the only thing standing. Here's Methuselah before there were trees growing around it and before it topped itself. After the trees were cut around it, there wasn't enough wind protection. And if you look at that sail on the top of the tree, the branching at the top, heavy wind just takes the top off. There you can see it also. I mean, they clear cut all around Methuselah. I'm presuming most of you have seen Methuselah. If you haven't, it's just past Skaggs Point as you're going south on the left-hand side in that flat, maybe 40 yards off of Skyline on a little trailer, but in clear sight, huge monster tree. And I'm going to skip this stuff in the name of time because I've been talking too long and move to Q&A. I will say finally, this is a picture of my son's a teenager at this point. He's 45 now. And this is pulling the middle of a belt wheel out of sub-drainage in Corte Madera Canyon. And there was just, when I would be out there, there was a lot of stuff out there. And this is after the earliest days when in World War II and again in the 1970s, a lot of people hauled stuff out for scrap metal because it was valuable as the prices peaked then. I did not say this, and I should have. There's always 3 talks you give. There's the one you meant to give, the one you give, and the one afterwards you should have given. And but I thought of this part. So during World War II, lumber prices went through the roof. Commodity prices in general went through the roof. And these last couple of mills, particularly the Alvin Hatch Mill in Prisma Canyon and the Charlie Borden Mill in Prisma Canyon, started up again after having been shut down. And they operated until 1920. And then in 1920, the price of lumber collapsed again as the war was over. And then they shut down and were permanently shut down. And there's actually only one major operating mill in San Mateo County after that, which is way off of Kings Mountain to the south. And it operated until the 1960s. And we're not going to talk about it tonight. But in that period from 1852 until 1920, it's over 35 mills. One I did not mention is the first one, 1852 mill, right off of Old Ranch Road in basically in the area where the Cromats live and immediately to the north of that on the west side of Old Ranch Road, which was a Richard Steam Mill. The Richard Steam Mill is visible to you in a different way because when you're down driving along 280 on the south from there, you can see a vertical cut in the hill that looks like a dirt road, and that's called Richard's Road. And it's called Richard's Road because Richards cut logs, first mill on the mountain in 1852, hauls them basically along what is Skyline now, down to where Richards Road comes off and runs down to what's now Huddard Park, and he skidded them all the way down that to the bottom. I mean, he took them down in when I say skidded, he took them down in wagons. That had to be perilous. I didn't say this, I should have. Skyline, as you know it, was called Summit Road in those days, and was, we don't even know how it was built. It was all built on private property by owners for their own purposes, collectively. But it stopped at what today is the junction of Kings Mountain Road and Tinnitus Creek. There was no Skyline south of that until 1922. And so Skyline, as you know it, south of that is part of the major development of building the road in 1922. It's ironic, of course, that for the next 30 years, there's almost no usage of Kings Mountain other than recreational and a very few hermits. So with that, I'm kind of done with formal skewing. I probably put a lot of you to sleep. I'm delighted to have Marlene help and oversee questions if you want, or however you want to do it. If you don't have any questions, then we can all go to sleep.
Hi.
Ken, Amber and I will go ahead and ask questions, and we'll let you know who these questions come from as well. So there are about 6 questions, and then something that came in 7, actually, if we count them with Methuselah-tree. So a couple of these are long. So, and Ken, you also have access, I believe, if you look up Q&A, if you want to read along. So the first question comes from Chris Reynolds. We all know redwoods are found only in California and extreme southern Oregon. Are they moving northward as the global climate changes? Part 1. Is Kings Mountain at risk of losing its redwoods during this century if less and less precipitation, i.e. drip fog and regular rain, does in fact fall, as some are predicting?
Redwoods are not moving north, although redwoods are what are kind of sometimes deemed as a potentially elite tree, and you can grow redwoods in lots and lots and lots of places. If they're not in the right environment where they get summer fog bath, they do not create a fertile cone. But redwoods sprout growth abundantly, as you know, and they're planted all over the world. I mean, they're growing commercially in New Zealand these days very nicely, and they're growing commercially in other places. And they grow and become big. In Washington State, the biggest trees in a lot of counties are giant sequoias from the Sierras, because they do really well there. Again, they're not going to reproduce, but you're not going to get a natural forest, but you can sequester carbon, for example, in them for a long time. So this is the part that's confusing to people, and I understand the nature of your question, Chris. Redwoods are in no threat from climate change. That people don't want to believe that, but it's true. The Save Your Redwoods League Redwood and Climate Change Initiative that I was co-chair of did an exhaustive study, the most exhaustive study ever done, including redwood plots in 10 major coastal redwood regions and 6 giant sequoia regions, going back and core drilling the trees and monitoring their growth over time. And the reality is the precipitation isn't quite as important, although it's important, as the available sunshine. And it turns out we've actually had a little too much fog. And climate change actually reduces the fog slightly, and the redwoods are growing at an expanding rate with climate change. They're actually doing better, not worse, because they've had too much fog. They need the fog, but there's a right amount of fog, and too little is bad and too much is bad, but they've had too much, and they've been doing just fine with too much, but as the fog levels have dropped some, they do even better. Redwoods are not threatened in any way that we know by climate change. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's factual once you get it. What makes plants grow? sun, and water. If you block out the sun, they don't grow as well, because we need the heat for the photosynthesis to produce carbohydrates that feed the tree.
Thank you, Ken. The second question that came in, and an anonymous attendee. Can you tell us, Ken, about Cypress Ridge Road? Is this public or private? And another egress from Skyline to the coast other than Highway 35 or Tenitas Creek?
Private? Is it passageway to the coast? Not unless they let you, any more than any other private road is. That's about it.
Okay, that was simple.
That's not really a history question, though.
Go ahead, Amber.
Oh, I was just going to take the next two. There's a question. Someone wanted you to go ahead and give us your thoughts on the Shelvin Party Ferris's death. You were saying that you suspected he was murdered because the coroner's report was done by a bunch of people who inherited the business, maybe, or something.
That's sort of right. I don't think that's quite what I said. So there's this. I mean, I wrote a San Mateo County Historical Association piece on this 30 years ago. There's this coroner's jury that determined that he committed suicide because of the say-so of two people, Hiram Haskins and a friend of Hiram Haskins. Hiram Haskins lived right up the road from Ferris, but in a winter storm, spent the night at Ferris's for some reason. Haskins, claiming for Stevens, who had left, that they stayed there because they were concerned because they thought Ferris was mentally unstable. They said that they heard the sound of something like a shoe dropping, and they asked Ferris if he was up. They yelled through the door, "Are you okay?" And he mumbled back at them, and so they just figured he was going to sleep. The coroner's jury found that it was suicide. He had been found in the morning by these men with a bullet hole in the back of his brain from a pistol on the floor, a long-barreled pistol. It's not so easy to put a long-barrel pistol to the back of your brain. You follow that? Just try it right now. It's not so easy. And then and I don't remember this specifically, but of the approximate 7 people on the coroner's jury, 4 of them were neighbors who bought his land. He had no children, he had no estate, he had nobody to take it, he had nobody to defend his positions. I believe that, and who was the biggest buyer of his land? You get one guess. Only one. Hiram Haskins. It just Hiram Haskins saying he committed suicide. I want to buy your land. How convenient.
Interesting. Thank you. Our next question is from.
So let me just take that a step further. So if you're going on Star Hill Road and you get past Sweat Road, you've gone a long way down. I told you where the Ferris School was. You get to that first house on the left. I don't know who lives there anymore. I mean, it's been years since I've been there, right? I used to know everybody. I don't even know who's on the mountain anymore half the time. Yeah, and I didn't know you were, and I didn't know that I drive past your house when I go to my son's place. So what do I know? That first house on your left then is where Hiram Haskins' house was, and there was a huge barn there. I remember the barn from when I was a kid. The barn burned down. And Alan Hoskins, that old timers will remember, who was a complete piece of work. Alan Hoskins ultimately bought that land from Wickett's father, but that was where Hiram Haskins lived. And the notion that he stayed at Ferris's doesn't make sense because he could have easily come back to his house. And Hiram Haskins was known as a rough guy. People were scared of Hiram Haskins.
Yikes.
He was also a horse and cattle thief.
That's pretty rough.
Not for those days.
No, not for those days.
I didn't tell people about how George Harkins died. I mean, George Harkins was a tough guy. Kind of a hermit, worked in the mills, hunted, did a little bit of minor farming. His father killed the last grizzly bear in San Mateo County. There's a book that lists the last known grizzly bear in every county in California. But George Harkins died from a beetle that bored through his ear into his brain. These are people that lived tough lives in what was then the middle of nowhere.
What kind of beetle?
I don't know, because I think it would have been tough to pull the beetle out. I don't know what kind of beetle. I just know that I saw the death certificate.
Aha. Well, I will think about beetles differently from now on. Mark Fletcher wants to know, on Star Hill Road.
Mark, my gosh. How are you doing, Mark?
On Star Hill Road, below where Native Sons Road goes off, is a group of about 4 very large trees that are now in the open space preserve. It almost looks like they were there preserved because a house might have been there. It's right on Star Hill. Do you know anything about these large trees and why they were not cut?
I mean, before you get to Native Sons, as you're going down. Is that right? Is that where you said that?
He said on Star Hill Road, below where Native Sons Road goes off. But I don't know which direction he's meaning. Mark, if you want to chat the direction of the trees, we can grab that.
Well, I can think of a whole series of big trees off of Star Hill Road. There's, a couple right on the road, which is where the office for the Virginia Mill was. And then there's some big ones lower down, but you're meaning below where the junction to Wickets is and where Native Sons goes off to the right, still going down Star Hill toward what used to be Liddon's and then on to Neil Young's property. I'm unaware of development down there other than a foundation to an old house that's on the left, right across from where Liddon's place was. Other than that, I couldn't tell you. I mean, the Virginia Mill was down that way. The Virginia Mill came right off across from Wicket's property there, and there was a lot of active use going down to the Virginia Mill. There's still a lot of stuff down at the Virginia Mill.
So it looks like Mark responded, I think it is where the office you showed in the later picture.
Yeah. So those trees, and then there's some periwinkle on the ground that grows there naturally the last time I was there. And that's also where the shell mound was. And that's the office for the Virginia Mill. And when they would haul the boards up from the bottom, and that's kind of an interesting story too. They mill the boards at the mill off the east side of Cornbadera Creek, and then they had a rail line that ran right up a ridge, and they loaded the logs onto flat cars, or they loaded the boards onto flat cars, and then they pulled them up by cable with the donkey engine, and there was a wire that ran down, and they had a buzzer with the wire, and they touch the wire, set the buzzer off, let them know to stop the pull. And some of those rails are still in place on the ground there. The last that I was there, but I've been there for a while, but they're probably still there. And there's still a lot of stuff down there. That mill operated until the 1906 earthquake basically knocked it asunder. And then they pulled the things up to where they could put them on wagons. And then they hauled them from the wagons up to on a dirt road up to Star Hill, and then to the office. And they yarded at the office. And those trees were there to shade the office, assuming that's what you're talking about.
Great. I'm going to take the next 2 questions. This one comes from Bill Rosenberg. How did the Redwood Park subdivision come to be? This is gonna be good.
So Redwood Park was originally designed as an architectural thing for a class at Stanford and was never actually intended to be real. And then in 1910, in a world before the San Mateo County Planning Commission, it was actually subdivided. If you look at the layout for Redwood Park, there's all these tiny little, parcels of land, none of which are big enough to build a house on. And yet there's roadways throughout it. And, as I guess, because all these little parcels were too little to really do anything with, except for where somebody could buy a number of them up close to the top of the hill and consolidate them and build on a number of them put together. Most of the heart of Redwood Park, became this kind of no man's land. I mean, I remember long time ago, I can't remember the one guy's name, Lee Hackoven was the other one, where they're living down in there and basically had a civil war between the two of them. And, I mean, it was kind of a no man's land. And still today, people show up. I couldn't remember how many years ago, but not many years ago, I remember I was at my son's place and a guy shows up, saying that he bought this piece of land in Redwood Park and he wanted to know how to get to it. And I told him, you can't get there from here because you're going to be trespassing. As he showed me his map and it's in the middle of Redwood Park and he's a little parcel about this big, right? And never going to be able to do anything with it anyway. And they sold those in newspaper ads for almost nothing in San Francisco newspapers. And people bought them in San Francisco thinking they're getting a piece. They show picture the redwood forest and you get to have your land. And people would buy them sight unseen. And this is, they did that subdivision in 1910. They're still, so they would also, right across from the firehouse is that building that used to be a gas station store. I don't know what's done with it now. I'm sure it's a residence, but it's a gas station store. And gosh, I can't remember the name of the lady that used to sell candy to children from it. Very nice woman. And, but originally, it was the weekend in the summer real estate office for selling off parcels of Redwood Park. But it was a paper subdivision that was never intended to be. And then a guy in San Francisco subdivided it.
So either Austria or Alma or Mark, one of the Fletchers said I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this right, the Knutsen, Knutsen? Yes,
Mrs. Knutsen, there you go. I'm getting to the age where a lot of names just they're there, but they're not there. But yes.
Well,
she was a very nice woman. She was a bit unusual, but a lot of the early Kings Mountain people were very nice, but a little unusual. That's.
For those of us who are newer, can you tell us where Redwood Park is?
Yeah, so if you think of or you can do this numbers of different ways, but if you were to go down to the end of Ware Road to where the Fredericksons is, down below you, Amber, Redwood Park is just below the Fredericksons, adjacent to the Fredericksons. If you go down County Road to the bottom, it ends into Redwood Park. Redwood Park is shaped like an L and constitutes most of that part that's the summer cabins right up on the top of the flats, and then going downhill into the steep part. It's 140 acres. It's kind of shaped like an L. The biggest part of it's at the top and goes down and bends. It's literally right across the firehouse also.
So just sharing, as the Fletchers are filled with some good historical information for you, Ken, the Knutsen's granddaughter lives there now.
Marvelous.
It's staying, right? Okay, so we have another question on directions. As best as you can do this, where's the
forward's the best direction? Okay,
where is the twisted redwood tree located? And that comes from Jerry Molitor.
So if you go it's in the headwaters of Lobitos Creek, if that makes any sense to you. I am just going to guarantee you, just being as brutish as I can possibly be, that I cannot possibly verbally describe to you how to get to it, because you got to go kind of know how to go through the forest cross country to get to it. It's not on a trail or anything, but it's off of the headwaters of Lobitos Creek.
And
actually off of the headwaters of Lobitos Creek that flows into Prisma Creek, there's a number of large pre-settlement redwoods.
Great.
Pre-settlement means the tree was there before Caucasians arrived.
Thank you. So here, this comes from another anonymous attendee. This is a fun one. What did you do with all the artifacts you have found over the years?
Depends. I have thousands of them, and most of them I have in storage, some in San Mateo County and some in Washington State. They'll all end up in San Mateo County eventually, but it's all a question of where I have storage.
Great. Amber, you got the next two?
So, you know, they fall into lots of categories, and I don't want the metal outside rusting. And I want the bottles protected. I got like something a little over 500 pre-1920 era bottles that, you know, I've collected out of mill sites and the like over time. And I don't want them broken. So they got to be in adequate storage.
So the next question I see is Forestry 101. There are some redwoods with spiral bark. Is the genetics of these morphs known? When did the redwoods arrive and how did they migrate with ice ages, especially given their very long life cycles?
So first, to your first question, no one really knows why they spiral. There's people with theories about it, and there's no actual scientific evidence to support spiraling. We just know it happens. There's evidence pro and con notions of genetics in this regard, but there's not a definitive answer. The top tree scientists in the world, top redwood tree scientists in the world, all of whom I'm connected to, don't have any confidence in any view on this topic. Redwoods retreated into the areas they are, but remember, they come from multiple different redwoods, which in today's vernacular, if they existed, would be in different genuses with redwood. The distinguishing feature of what makes redwood red is that they create tannic acid in the carbohydrate creation of photosynthesis. And that's what makes them redwoods. And in creating tannic acid, they aren't all the same tree. And as we moved through the Ice Age into the current environment, they simply solidified into the areas where they are now, where they've been, you know, stable in modern times. But, you know, as you probably know, once upon a time, variations of redwoods covered most of the different parts of the Western US.
So our next question is about the burned out redwoods that we all see everywhere. And the question is whether this was done after the tree harvesting or whether there was a subsequent wildfire or what that story is.
So there's not a perfect answer to that, but in Native American times, Native Americans burned the redwood region repeatedly on purpose. When the Native Americans would burn the redwoods, they got a lot of benefits out of it. First, at the time of the fire, they'd make the fire go uphill. Animals would go crazy running away from the fire. That'd make them easy to shoot. The fire would give the Native Americans easy egress. The areas that turned into grass would then feed more animals. It was just a good concept of Native American land management. based on fire charring in stumps, it's actually feasible to determine how often redwoods were burnt by geography. And in fact, in no place were they burnt more often than San Mateo County, where in Native American times, on average, they were burnt about every 11 years. And they went through and burned, set broadcast fires. The reality in, a slope with redwood, little slope, big slope, is stuff falls down from the trees, bills on the high side. Tree, stuff falls, bills on the high side as gravity takes it downhill. Fire comes along on the outside, burns through some bark. Years later, burns through some more bark. Years later, burns through some more bark. Ultimately burns a hole into the tree and starts burning out wood in the center of the tree. When you go through the forest, not all, but almost all of these will be with the fire, a hole on the uphill side. Little uphill, lot uphill, either way, because of the process I just described. On the other hand, when the loggers came, they burned everything harder and as hard as they could. And since logging days, we haven't had big fires on the mountain because of this, regime of Smokey the Bear and all the reasons that we don't like fire close to us. But all of that was Native Americans first, then loggers. That's pretty much it. But Native Americans were burning in San Mateo County redwoods about every 11 years.
Great, thanks. Thank you. So we've had a couple questions come in about the Methuselah. So one, this particular from Mark Moriarty is, other than the Methuselah, where is the largest redwood on the mountain? And then also if there's any other facts that you think are of interest on the Methuselah, feel free to share those at this time.
Facts on Methuselah. So, no one can really tell how old Methuselah is because you can't get a core drill to the center of it. And it's a, bizarre tree. You can't use most of the standard techniques to determine how old it really is. But it's a pretty old redwood. If I made a wild guess, I'd guess it's, 1,500 years old. Contrary to the way people think, people say redwoods grow to 2,000 years. 2,000-year-old redwood is more than 2 standard deviations away from the middle of the bell curve of an old growth forest. The average old growth tree in an old growth forest is about 800 years, regardless of where you are. The oldest tree known redwood in the world I co-discovered with Steve Sellett, and is 2,530 years within a rounding error of 5%. And that's the oldest. They don't get 2,000 very often. And that's that particular tree is in Redwood National Park. But Methuselah is about 7,000 feet in volume, cubic feet. And, in the scale of trees, that's not very big. In the scale of redwoods, that's not very big. And coastal redwoods, the biggest coastal redwood will be, like 39,000 cubic feet. Just to give you a scale,
Right.
Which would be in Jed Smith State Park. And, the biggest tree on Kings Mountain otherwise is going to be much smaller and is going to be either on Wickett's land or it's going to be on Kings Grove. And there's a couple of big honkers on Kings Grove, and there's a couple of big honkers on Wickett's land. But Methuselah is going to be the most cubic footage of anything on Kings Mountain.
Okay, so we have a couple more questions that have come in, and then one comment that actually I'm going to save till we close because I think it's a nice way for closing. So one question, do you know the legend of Bear Gulch being linked to a grizzly bear attack?
Sure, I do. So there's a guy who got the name Grizzly Rider, and there's a book about this. I have the book. Grizzly Rider was on the east side, down at the bottom. He got between a sow and her cub. The sow mauls him, chews him up pretty good, leaves him for dead. He was smart enough to play dead. Grizzlies don't, grizzlies, we wouldn't want grizzlies on Kings Mountain now. It just wouldn't work well. And Ryder was found and taken to a cabin. The doctor wanted to amputate his leg. It was chewed up so bad. They gave him a bunch of alcohol in preparation to amputate his leg. And Ryder went out the cabin window out the back and dragged himself off. He went and healed on his own and disappeared off to Boston and told his tale. And the tale became relatively famous. And the story of Grizzly Ryder is where the notion of Bear Gulch came from. And of course, that's Bear Gulch East, not Bear Gulch West. But going over, it's Bear Gulch, Bear Gulch.
Another great story, which brings us to the last question. This is from Heap Ho. He understands that you wrote a book about Kings Mountain quite a while ago, and I'm sure he's not the only one with this question. Where can folks get a copy?
Darned if I know. You could go to the San Mateo County Historical Association, and they had copies. I don't know if they still do or not. My La Peninsula articles on Kings Mountain, you can also get from the San Mateo County Historical Association. I used to sell them in the Kings Mountain Country Store, but of course that was a long time ago too. And I think the only place I know of, I actually ought to talk to Mitch Postal and see if they want to reprint any of that. I don't know, but I don't know what they have in inventory.
Well, I know that dating ourselves too, when our oldest, who's now 25, I was on maternity leave, and then Hank took time off, he would take him down and find his way to the San Mateo Historical Society and come back with articles and the peninsula and finding it fascinating. And that was when the country store was next door and we'd see the artifacts. So I told you it was the last question, but I see Patrick Winnan is raising that he has a question to share. I don't see it yet, so I'm gonna start with the other comment, and if Patrick's question comes in, I will ask it. So a comment came in from Bill Haydorn, which I think,
So Patrick, happy uncledom.
oh yes. Thank you.
He became an uncle today.
Yes, he did. So hopefully this can stay spotlighted on Ken, Amber, and not me when I'm sharing this for Ken, or at least minimally both of us. So Bill Haydorn chats and says he really misses the hiking in the redwoods and the Douglas firs with you, Ken. He always enjoyed your talks and bringing back the days of yore and the knowledge of timber and the evolution of lumbering. And Bill, we couldn't have come up with a better closing ourselves. So I saved that.
I never had a moment with Bill Haydorn that wasn't wonderful. And I could still, Bill doesn't have the legs he used to have, because that's what happens with age. But I could still sit in a chair and talk to Bill forever, and hope I can.
Excellent. And I know many of the folks who joined us today. Just so you know, there are still, even though we're at an hour and 42 minutes in, there are still 57 participants here. And until recently,
most of them just fell asleep and didn't turn their computers off.
70 attendees. And Ken, on behalf of not only KMA, but all of our participants today, we really thank you for going in such a deep dive. The PowerPoint, the answering all our individual questions, the stories, they're so colorful, and we can't thank you enough.
My pleasure. And I always love being on Kings Mountain.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. And we hope see you at the next KMA speaker series.
The 17th of February.